Hello, everybody. Good morning to those of you guys joining us from the US, and good evening for those of you guys joining us from China. And hello as well to everybody joining us from elsewhere around the world. My name is Devin Lau, and I am the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. And we're so glad to have Professor Frank Snowden join us today, as well as everybody else here joining us. First order of business, if those of you guys who are here, if you'd be able to turn on your webcams, that would be great. We want to make this feel like a good informal conversation with everybody together. And so it's always nice to be able to see some faces so that it doesn't feel like everybody is just eavesdropping on a conversation between Professor and myself. So for those of you guys that are here and able to turn on your webcams, that would be greatly appreciated. That way we can see some faces. A quick introduction, since some of you guys may be joining us for the first time. Yale Center Beijing was established in 2014 as Yale's only university-wide center, bringing the best of Yale to China and to the rest of the world. Throughout the pandemic, we've been able to host many online talks, of course, centered around COVID, but as well as many other topics from art history to biology to astronomy to poetry, you name it, we've done it. And so today's topic, of course, is a very relevant topic to all of us, which is the question of when exactly will the pandemic end, and other pertinent topics related to COVID from a historical perspective. And so let me introduce today my esteemed guest, Professor Frank Snowden. He is the Andrew Downey Orrig Professor Emeritus of History and of History of Medicine. He attended Harvard College before earning his DPhil from Oxford. And then from there, he began teaching at London University before he taught at Yale for many years, serving as chair of History of Science and Medicine at Yale. And of course, teaching his very popular course on epidemics. Before any of us were interested in epidemics, he was already teaching a very popular course on that, of which I was very lucky to attend as an auditor during my years as an undergrad. And so this is going to be a wonderful conversation. His books include Naples in the Time of Cholera, The Conquest of Malaria in Italy, and Epidemics and Society from the Black Death to the Present, which I would note was just recently translated and published in Chinese by today's co-hosts, Postwave Publishing. They have graciously agreed to gift us 5 books to today's audience members, which we will, they will, based on the quality of the questions today that are submitted, gift 5 books. So as I converse with Professor Snowden about pandemics and historical epidemics, please feel free to submit any questions you may have onto the chat box, which you should see on the bottom of your screen. And I will be monitoring those and doing my best to select questions from there. And many of you guys have already submitted questions online. And so I will also be asking questions based on those questions that have already been submitted. There were many of them, over 100 of them. And so I've done my best to curate them and kind of group them together. And so I apologize in advance, though, if we don't get to your particular question. Time is limited, unfortunately. So again, welcome. If you are able to turn on your webcams, we would greatly appreciate it if you turn it on so we could see you. And please feel free to enter any questions into the chat box while we begin our conversation. So, Professor Snowden, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation and to the questions that people are interested in asking.
Very much so. Here we are 2 years after we first hosted you for a talk. And at that point, I believe you had just returned from Italy. You had just recovered from COVID yourself. And now we're still in the process of recovering from a global pandemic, or maybe we're actually still in the midst of a global pandemic. You can't really know until it's over, I suppose. But who would have expected that 2 years later, we're still talking about the pandemic? but maybe we should have expected that. Maybe we should have known that pandemics do tend to drag out over time. And so that is to say, compared to epidemics in the past, if you take into account, of course, that we're much more globalized now and things move at a faster pace and we're more interconnected, I am curious to know from a historical perspective and from your perspective, actually, what is it unusual that we're still talking about the pandemic 2 years in, or is this actually a pretty typical time frame? Does this particular pandemic that we're in, is it actually running a pretty similar course to past epidemics that we've seen?
Well, that's a complicated issue. And I would say I'm not amazingly surprised that we're still in the midst of this very unhappy experience with COVID-19. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is historical, and the other has been in terms of societal responses. History seems to indicate that there isn't a general pattern that all pandemic diseases conform to. I think each disease needs to be examined in its own right, and it needs to be determined where on that spectrum it fits. The smallpox is the only disease that's ever been eradicated by human agency. So that is an outlier. And it seems there smallpox is a very particular disease that was susceptible to that. And it's not zoonotic. It can't be reintroduced. When you get rid of it, it's gone. Other diseases are not like that for the most part. And the experience of, let us say, bubonic plague is mixed. It kept returning, and for centuries, and it's not eradicated now. It's not a pandemic threat, but it does cause 1,000 or so deaths around the world every year. And there are natural reservoirs. If we look at AIDS, it's no longer the dreadful pandemic that it was, but it is not gone. It's still with us and still something that needs to be considered in terms of public health and health education. So it's still a live issue. And that, if you like, gives us a sort of parameter, a series, a spectrum. And it seems to me that we could expect that it would be a difficult matter to get rid of COVID-19 in an easy fashion. And I think there was a lot of misplaced optimism. And I think that's perhaps where I would begin with some of the societal response, I think, is absolutely critical. And we've made a number of wrong turns. One of those is to think that vaccines are a standalone panacea. I don't want to be taken as an anti-vaccinationist. I've been vaccinated and boosted, and I urge everyone to have vaccines. It's not that. It's really that we've been asking vaccines to do more than they're capable of doing. They're a powerful tool, but not a magic bullet. And it seems to me that we've sort of thought of them, that this belief that there is a simple technological solution, whereas in fact, technology is powerful, but it has to be set in a societal context. And so one of the problems with just relying on technology is that we stop thinking of other measures that need to be taken. And vaccines are most powerful if they are not taken alone, but are part of a general strategy with other non-pharmaceutical measures. And that we rather, especially in the United States, where we have made the vaccines now are really a standalone measure. Then there's the fact that what I would say we've forgotten the communitarian aspect of pandemic disease. And this is particularly true of Western countries, which have been noted for their individualist response to the pandemic. And that wasn't the case in many countries in Southeast Asia, also in Africa, and even to a lesser extent in South Latin America, where the people have been astounded, especially in the early waves of COVID-19, at the way in which Africa was not the disaster that the World Health Organization was expecting. And one of the reasons for that is that there are many, one could discuss that, and there are many reasons behind it. But one of them is revealed by the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which means I am because you are, which means we're all in the same boat. This is a community collective problem, and therefore there was a great deal of compliance, and there was also cooperation among the states and the African Union, and there were very moving examples and creative ones in the ways in which Rwanda responded, and even the arts were brought into play, and music generated songs about how to respond to COVID. That was, I think, a very important lesson that we need to learn all around the world, particularly as we seem to have retreated into nationalist silos, where a country thinks that it can simply eliminate the disease on its own territory. They've forgotten that viruses don't respect national borders. And we see now that COVID-19 is genuinely an international problem. And I think the truth of the matter is that we won't be successful in stopping the pandemic in ways that we would wish. I don't mean total eradication, but I mean control of the disease until we accept that it's an international problem, until vaccine nationalism, for example, and the hoarding of vaccines by wealthy countries is actually detrimental, because we see that every single patient of COVID-19 is in fact a petri dish. And the more patients and more petri dishes there are, the more variants we're going to see. And that's what we have seen. And some of those variants are now evolving in ways to elude our immune responses. So breakthrough infections are now commonplace, and I think we'll see more and more of that. And so we're not going to reach a herd immunity, it looks like. This is going to be a much more tenacious problem, and I'm not preaching Armageddon, gloom, and despair. Far from it. In fact, I would say I'm trying to say it's time for a call to awareness, a call to arms, that with what happens with the disease, the good and bad news is that it's up to us. It depends on us and how we respond. If we respond well, we can radically minimize the suffering and the cost to our societies. If we adopt measures that we should know are not going to be effective, then the disease will be more of a problem, and we could have very troubling variants in our future. So I think that's a long-winded, complicated answer, but I think it's a very complicated subject, and we really require a lot of our best thinking and creativity in order to contain this disease. And that's part of the reason that it's taken us so long at this point.
Great, thank you. I can see this conversation going many different directions after that very comprehensive answer, but I do want to stop and say maybe we should start with a simple clarification. I think people tend to use the word pandemic and epidemic interchangeably, but there are technically slight differences. So if you could just very quickly kind of give us definitions so we know what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. There, in terms of our relationship with what should I say, with infectious diseases, there is also a spectrum. And the first is, we say, an outbreak, which is a very limited upsurge in terms of a number of cases in a community, in a town, even in a country, perhaps. Then comes an epidemic, which is, there's no precise boundary between an outbreak and an epidemic. An epidemic is when the outbreak has succeeded in establishing widespread community transmission. That is above all within a nation or a region, perhaps of the world. And then that can explode and become something more, which is a pandemic, which is an epidemic that's gone global, or at least has crosses continental boundaries and is international in a meaningful and quite transmissible way. That is, once again, there is no, this is a bit in the eye of the beholder, and there isn't a scientific marker of when an epidemic has become a pandemic. But clearly, there's no one who would say that, deny that COVID-19 is an ideal type of a pandemic disease, just as the Spanish influenza from 1918 to 1920 that affected, like COVID, every continent.
Great, thank you. And so you've already talked about a couple different pandemics that we've seen in history, but I would say in the past, probably most people's understanding of a whether you use epidemic or pandemic would probably started and stopped with the plague, or Black Death. That was probably the preeminent example that people knew. And yet you mentioned that we still have the plague with us as a disease, and both literally, as in it still is around, but also as sort of an idea. And so, but for the most part, I don't think anybody spends much time worrying about catching the plague anymore. And so that sort of leads to the question.
I do, in fact, have a friend who caught the plague.
Yeah, so it does happen, but most people I don't think are worried about Black Death anymore.
Exactly.
So then that leads to the question of how exactly does a pandemic end, both in the literal sense of a disease sort of no longer spreading, and or at least not being as prevalent and as decimating, but also how long does it take usually from a historical perspective for it to leave the consciousness of the general population and for it to become, I guess, less dominant as an idea or as a talking point. And so that's sort of maybe another way that pandemics end, is that the public is no longer gripped by it anymore.
Absolutely. I'll trick that I think it's so interesting, the awareness of disease and of the memory of the experience. And once again, I keep returning to my metaphor of a spectrum, because I think that's the best applicable response to that particular question, which is to say, the spectrum looks like this. One of the most devastating pandemics ever to strike mankind was the 1918-1920 Spanish influenza, which killed, the estimates keep going up, and now there are many authorities who suspect that as many as 100 million people died during the Spanish influenza. So this was a huge catastrophe by any standards. And yet, and it's only 100 years ago, it's barely beyond living memory, if you want to say. And therefore, for that reason, what's astounding is that it's often known as the forgotten pandemic. And little history was written about it. It's not remembered much in literature of the period. There wasn't a great artistic response to the Spanish influenza. People forgot it. Now, the reasons that people forgot it are interesting, I think, which include such factors as what else was going on at the time. And the Spanish influenza was perhaps overwhelmed by people's preoccupation with the First World War, during which it occurred, and with the peace settlement, and also with the enormous political and social cataclysms that followed in the wake of the war, with the revolutions across Europe, in Germany, in Russia, obviously, and many others as well. And social change and transformation was the order of the day, and people were very much preoccupied with that. Also, there was the fact that the Spanish influenza, its mortality and its morbidity were concentrated in a period of a few months. And it races through the body very quickly. It also races through a community in perhaps 6 weeks, and even through a nation in a couple of months. And so it was, in that sense, it was the polar opposite of the Black Death, which you've mentioned as a sort of prototypical epidemic disease, which was there for centuries, which besieged communities for months at a time, which people did not forget, and which was not counterbalanced by Europe being overwhelmed and by a general European war, let us say, or that sort of thing. And so the plague was a dominant experience, and it dominated, it transformed literature. It established public health as a discipline, its paintings and churches, whereas that hasn't happened with the Spanish influenza. And now the question is, where will, I think the question suggests, where is COVID-19 likely to stand on that spectrum? And the answer to that, it seems to me, has to be that we don't know yet. It really is up to us. Are we going to be determined that this is a memory that we need to preserve, that we need to see and learn its lessons, how we did things that were well, how we did things that weren't? Are we going to remember the sacrifice and heroism of healthcare providers who gave their lives, and frontline workers in this experience, the suffering of the millions of people who died? Myself, I'm hoping that this will give rise to resilient, creative responses. And there's reason to think that that might. In city planning, for example, there are responses of reimagining cities and using urban planning in ways that will make us more resilient and safer in the future, since cities are the front lines in our response to COVID-19. There are also moving examples of community resilience in places that the World Health Organization was most worried about, those informal communities in third world cities like Lagos. And there, the policies that we can see here, a scientific blindness, that is to say, public health and technology and all measures as take place in a social context. And the advice for what worked, let us say in London, to wash your hands, to wear a mask, to practice social distancing, isn't practical advice in the slums of Lagos and many of the other mega cities, favelas in Brazil, barrios in Mexico, in Latin America, in Nairobi. But what happened was that the inhabitants of some of those places came together and thought that they had been forgotten and they needed to protect themselves, and they devised methods of coping, let us say, not eradicating, but coping with the infection in very creative ways. And I hope we'll remember that, because that's very impressive and very important, and teaches us a lesson that this really is a worldwide experience, and we can't be in national silos if we want to deal with it effectively. And that even biomedical science needs to take place and unfold in a context, and needs to be aware of the enormous disparities of human living conditions and circumstances. And I think we failed that test during so far in this pandemic, which is one of the reasons I think it will be with us for some time.
So both encouraging and discouraging, depending on I guess how we move next, right? Which is
precisely. The good news is that it is up to us, and as I also say, that's also the bad news.
right. And so just to clarify, when do pandemics end? How do they end? And I guess when will this all be over is really what everybody is thinking, I think, right? And I guess the answer then is those are all answers that are still in flux a little bit.
And that it depends not on the virus doesn't have agency, it doesn't have intentions. It's the interface between us and the virus that's important, and how are we going to deal with this virus? And that's the problem. And I think that so far public health responses have not been adequate to this challenge. This doesn't mean that they can't be and won't be. I'm not actually expecting this to be doomsday, but we're taking a very long time about it, and we can do and should do much better.
So that's really interesting, because it's we've already sort of pointed to many different historical examples that we could have looked at and learned from, and yet so in general it seems like it's not really a matter of if a pandemic will occur, but a matter of how often and when. And yet we were so like woefully unprepared for this particular disease. So as someone who's sort of seen this from a historical perspective, were you surprised at all at how we as individuals, as a society and globally responded to the pandemic? Or are we kind of par for the course here?
I think I was surprised by how poorly we responded to this pandemic. And the reason is that there had been warning flashing yellow lights for some time, that we have entered a new era of being tremendous because of globalization. With what happens in Jakarta in the morning is happening in Los Angeles in the evening. And in that world, we need to think differently about. Also, we have so invaded and through our environmental negligence, should I say, animal habitat, that we have more and more zoonotic, that is, diseases of animal populations spilling over into human beings. In this climate, we had an enormous warning light with avian flu in the 1990s. We then had SARS and MERS, Nipah virus. There's been a whole host, even Ebola, though it's not a respiratory disease, so it is different, but the others fit a pattern, and those were rather ignored to a large extent. There were warnings. Britain had an extensive report that said that pandemic influenza was the great threat to human society because of the nature of the society that we've built. There were, let us remember, in the it was 2005 to 7, there were hearings at the US Senate, and Anthony Fauci, the American, as many people of course know, a scientist about epidemic diseases, said that it was inevitable that there would be a major epidemic challenge to the world. It was the same as meteorologists could say to someone who lives in the Caribbean, you're going to have a hurricane, but it would be impossible to say in advance how strong the winds and floods would be. But if you didn't prepare, you were very unwise. Similarly, it would be very unwise not to prepare for that eventuality. And the World Health Organization raised this very same alarm. And for a little while, people paid attention, people being also our politicians and public health officials, but slowly the funding, they did not continue in a sustained way to devise plans and funding and scientific research for dealing with the new kinds of challenges. So we were warned as an international community, but we didn't listen. And we didn't listen in a sustained and constructive way. May I contrast that with a case where society did listen? I don't see, it's not impossible, and that's the case of Asiatic cholera. In the wake of devastations, terrible experiences with Asiatic cholera, the British scientific and public health community launched the reimagining of cities throughout the United Kingdom and retrofitting them with sewers and paved streets and housing regulations, food marketplace regulations. And this went certainly across Europe and large swathes of the world, where cities incorporated this in their urban structures. And so Asiatic cholera is something that is, although it's still with us, it's not a pandemic threat in those parts of the world where those reforms have been taken place. The city of Paris was completely rebuilt. So is the city of Naples. So we have the capacity to do something equally innovative, and thinking about reimagining cities could well be a part of that. And so the world responded positively to Asiatic cholera. And my sadness so far is that we haven't responded in such an imaginative way to COVID-19.
So you've talked a lot about how with a pandemic, there tends to be a mark on society, whether that's through changes in public planning or public health, art, religion, culture, cultural norms, all those things. So, and you've already given us some examples of those, and you've touched on those. Having now lived through a global pandemic, what lessons do you think we might actually learn this time? What things do you foresee kind of actually sticking, and what lessons do you think we'll soon forget, a la the Spanish flu?
Yes, I think the first thing that I'm worried we're likely to forget as we're distracted by other priorities is the need for sustained funding for public health systems and for basic scientific research into those, and surveillance of those places and those diseases that are likely. It's possible to know in advance the kinds of diseases that we're most vulnerable to, and it's possible to prepare to confront those. And there isn't, in principle, a reason that the world can't do that. And we need to be organized internationally. Will there be, for example, a strong World Health Organization so that there is a unified world response and nations collaborate in dealing with pandemic disease? That would be an enormously powerful step, and it's one that I fear we may not take. I'm hoping it's a wonderful thing to be absolutely wrong. And I hope I'm absolutely wrong in my sense that that's likely not to happen. But if it did, it would be wonderful. And again, it's up to us as human beings, whether we do that or not. And so that is a major factor. I think it's also partly up to us at the moment in pressing pressing those in responsibilities in these fields, that this is what we would like as citizens to see happen. Artists portray and express art is in its role partly to provide us imagery, the lexicon in which to process and share our lived experience. And I think the artistic community can play a role in maintaining this. The environmental community can tell us a lot of the ways in which global warming and our devastation of the environment is making us more vulnerable. I think we can learn from this pandemic as well that social inequity is a major driving factor in pandemic disease. And we need, there's no reason in principle that the issue of poverty, the issue of the vast gulf between the developed North and the less developed South, I'm speaking only in economic terms, that distance can't be widened and addressed. So we're living in a world of globalization, as you said at the outset. Since we're living, governance, I would say, has not kept pace with the economic, social, cultural pace of globalization. And so I think that's a major challenge. And maybe the last one I would say, because I think people are very aware of this, Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, said early on in the pandemic that there was a following pandemic along with the natural one, and that was a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. And now that we live in a global world of media, social media, I think that it's very important that be in some way made use of in ways that are not anarchic, so that there is some regulation of intentional misinformation and disinformation, and that the media also can be, this leads also to the possibility of greater public education. I think that's, there's a lack of understanding of the science of COVID-19 at the popular level, and that's even amongst our authorities, and that's a global problem, and we could do much better in that, on that front, and that's something that could also be addressed. And one would like to hope that international agencies like UNESCO would find creative ways to deal with that issue of the educational content must include an understanding of the biological world in which we're immersed. It's part of us. We have an interface with it constantly, and we need to know more about it to appreciate the opportunities, the dangers, what we should be aware of in that interaction.
I find the point that you made about media and misinformation so fascinating, because I know in your work you talk a lot about how in a pandemic there's the disease itself, but there's also the mirror in which the pandemic will hold to society, and it'll reveal so much about the social, cultural, and psychological aspects of society. And sort of the deeper societal issues that were already there, or perhaps catalyze them to become more prevalent. So what do you see as some of the implications of this, shall we call it the COVID era, in terms of long-term societal symptoms, not just the disease, but sort of what are the other sort of psychological long-term effects that we may see? What are the other kind of social effects that we may see that come out of this COVID era?
Yes, I think that we have been profoundly affected and profoundly changed. And I think the great challenge is, will those changes be ones that we take responsibility for and make sure that they move in directions that make us more resilient rather than less so? I think that's the challenge. I think one would say that pandemic diseases are great, in a sense. I'm not thinking in religious terms here, but they are a sort of moral and spiritual drama of that reveal and demonstrate how we react to each other as human beings. And the great challenge is to accept we have created a global world, and with that, we have created global dangers. COVID-19 is nature speaking to us in a way, and reminding us of the world that we have created. And we've created conduits for diseases, respiratory viruses particularly, to be transmitted from animal reservoirs to us, and to be transmitted rapidly around the world, and to spread in the kinds of communities that we've created. Those are conduits. The disease is not actually seeking those out. We have created and promoted and made that possible. That being so, we also have the possibility for closing those conduits. We don't have to be inert victims to an onslaught of malevolent diseases. They're not malevolent. It's we who control that destiny. And I think it's a call to a more responsible and aware governance is a critical feature of what we need to do going forward. And regarding the issue of social media, I think that speaks to the problem of is it a totally unregulated environment of social media seems to me rather dangerous. There's a balance to be had between over-regulation and under-regulation, but I think we've erred entirely on the free market side, certainly in the West. And I think that we're paying a price for that with public misunderstanding, and that leads to lack of willingness to comply with public health regulations, such as getting vaccinated, wearing masks, social distancing, and all the rest. So that's a major factor too.
Great. And just a reminder, if people have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box, and we'll be happy to try to incorporate some of those. So you talked about social distancing, masking, hand sanitizer, and things like that. I guess a lot of people are wondering, is that just going to be the new normal? And maybe we can step back a little bit from that question and ask a more broad question here, which is there such a thing as returning to normal? Is there a normal that we return to? Is that even possible? Or are we going to have to deal with a new normal?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a wonderful question, and it is something that's on everyone's mind. And my response to that would be that there is a great desire to go back to no longer having to worry about this dreadful disease. And that's entirely understandable. Fatigue with regard to the measures that have been taken around the world to cope with it, that is entirely understandable. But it's not realistic to think that we can just, after this, go back to the way the world was before. If there's a logical fallacy there, the world as it was before is what brought us this disaster. So why would we want to return to something that didn't work and that created a great international tragedy? And for that reason, I think we do need a new normal, not a return to the previous normal that didn't work and involved us in profound exposure to preventable dangers. That's the tragedy. It's not, COVID is not a tragedy in the sense that it happened, but it's a tragedy that its magnitude was unnecessary. It did not need to be the enormous disaster that we've experienced. That was definitely in our control. I'm not expecting that we'll ever create a world where there aren't contagious diseases. I'm not expecting the Garden of Eden, but I do think we can do much, much better, and that this is a very good example of a dangerous disease experience that our failure to respond properly transformed into an enormous catastrophe. That need not have happened. That's the tragedy of it.
Right. Many people have talked about sort of a concurrent tragedy or a concurrent sort of epidemic, which is sort of the psychological feeling of loneliness, or the mistrust of other people, perhaps. Sort of there's a sort of more collective psychological effects here of the pandemic. Could you speak a little bit to that in terms of do we see sort of that similar response in other historical epidemics? Is it a unique nature of COVID and the modern society that we're in that has caused that, or what exactly, when we talk about the psychological impact of diseases here, what are we looking at?
Yes, let's say that one of the enormous lessons that needs to be learned from this experience is the tendency to separate mental and physical health. And we as a world community, I'm not pointing a finger at any single entity or individual or country, we as a world community thought of public health and public health practitioners were trained to think in terms of physical disease. And funds were allocated on that basis in terms of research. Now, it happens that the history of pandemic diseases would suggest something much more complex. If we think, for example, it's dangerous to be too doctrinaire when talking, let us say, about the Black Death, because psychology and psychiatry had not emerged as disciplines, and there were no diagnostic categories with which to deal with mental disease. But I think if one looks, for example, at the late tragedies of Shakespeare, like King Lear, Shakespeare his whole life was influenced. He had been in lockdown against the Black Death. His career had normally, as a dramatist, had nearly come to an end. And for a while, he'd actually given up writing drama and thinking he had to become a poet because due to the should we say, we call them social distancing provisions, it wouldn't be possible to have live theatrical performances anymore. And so I think the late dramas of Shakespeare are actually portraying the mental landscape that people were living in that had been devastated. And I think that gives us a good indication of how mental psychological effects were there. And if you look at paintings like Bruegel's The Triumph of Death, you can see that is a psychologically, it's haunting to look at. It's troubling. It really is a psychological trauma that we're seeing portrayed in front of us. And then if let's come forward to a time when we did have psychology and psychiatry, and we see the Spanish influenza, and there it's important to note that there was a trail of mental disease that followed, and the Spanish influenza, and the 1920s saw psychiatric wards being filled with people who had a new diagnostic category, dementia precox, it was called. Now it would be called schizophrenia. As a result of the disease. Now, it may be that we don't know, but it may be that that was because of social isolation, insecurity, fear, stress, and it may be that also that it was due that the disease affected the central nervous system, or possibly both. And we can also see, if we look at SARS, there have been studies in Hong Kong, for example, that show that people who, both patients and physicians and healthcare people who experience SARS, are still being treated for psychiatric disorders, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, we would call it. And one of the features of COVID-19, as we see already, that let me just take the example of the United States, which it could be any country. The point is that we see this upsurge in anxiety, in antisocial behaviors, in opioid abuse, domestic violence. All of these forms, I think, are part of, and then there's the biological feature, which it now seems increasingly probable that COVID-19 also has central nervous system effects. And that is clearly evident in long COVID, which does not depend on the severity of the disease. And it seems as though we ought to be prepared for a long trail of people who are, again, not, don't fully recover and are disabled and never live up to their potential, or developmentally impaired and psychologically impaired, and perhaps cognitively impaired as a result of this experience. So I think that's an aspect that we really do need to redefine public health in terms of its mental consequences. And we need to make more facilities available to people in times of large-scale disease, so that people have support for dealing with these issues, and that they're treated early rather than later. So I think that's a challenge that does clearly emerge from this disease, but it's not new. It's not the first time that this has happened, and that's all the more reason for expecting that it probably won't be the last.
Great. So I think what we've seen, I think, throughout the pandemic is sort of there's a certain sort of faith that's placed in technology and science, and its ability to really, I think you talked about a misplaced faith of even being able to eradicate this disease, which you mentioned. Basically, there's only been one disease ever in the history of mankind that's been eradicated, right? So there seems to be this strong faith in technology and science, and I do want to say that we should credit the scientists who have worked tremendously to give us the technology to test and to track diseases, and even the people who worked on the vaccines and were able to globally work on this and share information so quickly. And so much credit to all that work that's been done. But as we see, that even with all that technology, we're still in the middle of a pandemic here. And so sort of this faith that people have in science and progressiveness and being able to cure all these things doesn't seem to, at least experientially, be good enough. And so how would you sort of, as we try to move on as a society, how would you say what the relationship is with policy and technology, but also just what exactly can we do and should we be doing to prevent or at least better prepare for the next pandemic?
That's a fascinating issue, and one that I think it merits a lot of thinking. What I want in no sense to be thought to be attacking science or technology. I believe in both. And they are providing us with very powerful tools, therapeutically, and preventively, the vaccine. One of the silver linings in this dark cloud has indeed been advancement of medical science and genetics for testing, as you said, for therapeutics, for vaccination. All of those are major triumphs, and they happen so quickly on the basis of international collaboration. And that's something also that's a moving aspect of this, where it's a world problem. It's science is the most international of all human inquiry. And so in that sense, I think it's appropriate that it should be so. But I think that there's a difference from wanting to have and investing in science, which is entirely appropriate. And we do need scientific tools. The problem, I think, is a different one, which I would call magical thinking, which is not a rational assessment of what science can do and in the context in which it's best able to help us. It's the idea that science should have some magic pixie dust that will fix everything for us, and we don't need to do anything more. And this is not new. We could see after World War II, there was a tremendous belief in technology, and on the part of laymen and scientists, it was thought that each disease would be eradicated by the advancement of science, so that DDT would abolish malaria and dengue fever, that the antibiotics would abolish pneumonia and tuberculosis, and they would all be eradicated. Now, antibiotics are a wonderful tool. DDT can be a powerful tool, but they were not, the fallacy was not to say, oh, these are useful, but to say, this is going to do all the work for us. And I think that we're not in a position, and never will be, to use science as a standalone, apart from other things which have to do with the social contract between citizens and the people who govern them, that there has to be confidence so that compliance can take place. There needs to be a realization that the tools will really work best if they work within a context of cooperation, and that other features of public health, traditional ones, humble ones, also have a very important role. Social distancing is tremendously, we know that it works. And so why wouldn't we use it along with the vaccines? That's a mystification that I don't understand even to this day. And also that you can't have vaccines work without educating the public on why they work, what will their utility be, and we've seen enormous resistance. And I think that part of that has been the failure to explain to people effectively why they need those. And we also need to realize that there are vulnerabilities that science doesn't deal with: poverty, pre-existing conditions due to pollution. Animal spillover is not something we can cure with a vaccine. And so we need to be realistic about what science can and can't do, and not make magical requests too much of science. And this also, I think, for public health, medical scientists, they also need, I would make the suggestion, a major problem has been hubris, claiming that there are solutions that will work before we really know that they will. And I think that hubris is something that has undermined our response time and time again in the past, and also with regard to COVID-19. We need to be more modest in our expectations and be sure that we don't disillusion people by telling them that science can do this when it really can't. We don't know that it can do it until we actually are in the process of doing it, and we haven't reached that stage yet. So I think hubris is an attitude of mind that's very dangerous to us.
All right. We are hitting the time limit, so thank you everybody for all your questions. And again, I'm sorry that we're not able to get to all of them. I guess to sort of, this would be the last question. Many people have asked regarding the future of pandemics and epidemics, and whether we're entering into this new age where we should be expecting more and more frequency of these diseases, as well as just a variety of new emergent diseases to appear. And I know that you're working on a new book as well. So this might be a good corollary to also talk about your new book here. But can you tell us a little bit about sort of, emergent diseases and whether we're stepping into a new era here? Are there unique things about society now that make us more susceptible to pandemics? And sort of just what is your prognosis for the future here?
Okay. I think I would say that one of the good news and bad news is that we're still human beings. And human beings live in a natural environment in which there are almost infinite numbers of microbial agents that can do us harm. Of many, many different types. That is not a new problem. That is the human dilemma. And I don't think that's going away. There seems, I would regard it as a kind of hubris, the idea that this new normal, that this is something unprecedented. That really shows amnesia. And that amnesia isn't helpful to us. We are inescapably in a part of a biological matrix, and we are vulnerable to diseases, and there will be certainly in our future pandemic challenges, epidemic challenges that will emerge. What I think we can say, though, is that our society has changed, and during the Industrial Revolution, we, as a world, were vulnerable to diseases transmitted through contaminated food and water because of the social conditions of the industrialization process and urbanization, unregulated, uncontrolled. And so Asiatic cholera was a major threat. But we no longer live in that world. And although cholera is still present in the world, sadly so, it's not a pandemic threat because nations that have sanitary infrastructure are no longer vulnerable. But that doesn't mean we're invulnerable to disease, just to a particular type. We've created a new type of society, highly industrialized, highly globalized, and that hasn't ended the disease challenge. It's just changed it. So now we're vulnerable, but to new types of diseases. And we're particularly entered an era where what we're most vulnerable to is pulmonary viral diseases, because they are partly because they're zoonotic, and we have radically altered our relation to the animal world, destroying biodiversity, deforesting the planet, so that we have many more interactions with bats, with all kinds of animals with whom human contact was much more limited in the past. So it's not by chance that the new diseases that have been emerging are overwhelmingly zoonotic, from animal spillover. That's not by chance. That's the kind of society we've created. And we're also very vulnerable to diseases in terms of the numbers of people in our planet. We have an enormous number of global population is huge, perhaps not sustainable in a healthy way in terms of the resources of the planet. We also have dense agglomerations of mega cities throughout the world, and they're becoming more and more of them. It's thought that there will be in Africa, where urbanization is proceeding apace, there will be by 2100 a number of cities with as many as 70 million people in them. And we haven't learned how to have healthy cities with that degree of density and that size. And so we are vulnerable to these pulmonary diseases that transmit readily in that environment. And so I think that that's what we're facing, which is not something new in the sense that we've always been vulnerable to disease from the plague of Athens in the 5th century BC and before that, but that's we have historical accounts of that event. The fall of Rome was partly a result of malaria. We had the plague of Justinian. They've always been vulnerable. Leprosy was rampant in the Middle Ages. So vulnerability to disease is the lot of human beings. But we need to be mindful and intelligent of what kinds of diseases are we vulnerable to. And I feel absolutely certain we will have other pandemic challenges. There's something dangerous in the idea that we're tired of this. And we want to get back to our lives because nature hasn't finished with us. Nature will always be with us. And it does, if we're tired of nature, nature's not tired of us. And so we need to deal intelligently with nature and the microbial world because we're immersed in it. And we see our history over the last 100 years has been the growing threat of pulmonary viral diseases. From the Spanish influenza through the whole list is now becoming, but that depressingly long, but that should tell us something. We should pay attention that it's a particular type of disease, and why won't there be other viral diseases transmitted by the pulmonary route through the air that will challenge us in the future? And I'm not saying will overwhelm or destroy us, but will challenge, and how devastating they are will depend on how we have prepared. So preparedness is, I think, one of the things that we must see as this experience as a call to arms, not to despair, but to resilient determination, not to have these enormous tragedies that are so often preventable.
Great. Thank you so much for such a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. And I feel like we could talk probably for the whole day if we wanted to.
For you, I wouldn't stick that upon you, but thank you very much.
Yeah, but thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for great questions. Thank you for Postwave Publishing for generously providing some books. So they will get in touch directly with people who have asked the questions. And thank you all for joining us. I will unmute everybody so that you guys can all have a chance to thank Professor yourself. And per tradition, if people would be willing to turn on their webcams, we can take a group photo together as a slight way of commemorating being together here. So.
And wonderful. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And it's been a great pleasure to share my own thoughts and preoccupations with you. And I'm very grateful for the very interesting and challenging questions that were asked. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor
Thank
Snowden.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
And
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Snowden.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
absolutely.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Devin.